Dylan Scott Cotting asks, I would love to know the process to change the tuning on a harp, i.e. going from equal temperament to compromise tuning. That's a great question. Here's a G harp that needs some tuning, and we can take a little look at the tuning temperament. Now, what is equal temperament versus compromise or just? If you opened up your acoustic piano and you hit, a low D on the lower end, you'd hear even the higher strings. You could touch them and you can feel that they're vibrating. So they have this sort of sympathetic vibration. Okay, they're picking up and they're working along with the resonance of that one low note that has a lot of energy, that's vibrating at a low frequency. The harmonica reeds aren't as sympathetic one to another. There is a little bit of cooperation, and one will pick, if they're close enough in tune, if they're close enough to be harmonious, they will sync up in harmony, and I'll show you that. But if not, they sound dissonant. Okay, and the way we make them become harmonious is we adjust their pitch. What goes hand in hand when you're tuning a harp and the temperament is that the notes, the pitch of each reed is kind of fuzzy. We really mess around with the absolute pitch, but we modify it with our breath force, we modify it with our embouchure, with the direction of our chin. Everything can impact. See that needle bouncing around. Depending how hard I hit it, depending on my embouchure, if I'm tense, screw that up. So the best way to have an objective sense of what's going on is to play two notes at the same time. Okay? Because then both notes in the pair will be affected by your breath force and your embouchure in the same way, if you're relaxed enough as you play this. So that's the key. I know if I'm happy with the pitch of this note, I can play them together, and I can gather that the top note needs to be lowered. So let's lower that note by a little bit. Couple of cents. That's the octave. I still hear a little bit of wah 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 as those notes are played together. The harmonica too. That's dead solid. That's an octave. When you're looking at temperaments, you can probably get away with making the octaves in tune and not worrying about the other intervals. So keep your octaves in tune and then worry about the other intervals. And that's where you make the choice. So I'm happy with the tonic, so the 4 and the 7 blow. Now how am I going to tune the 5? Well, do I want the 4 and the 5 to sound in harmony? Then I'll tune that 5 to be a bit flat relative to the 4. If I want that not to be in harmony, but I want the note to be equal temperament or closer to 0, I'll tune it so it hits 0, and then I'll tune the other thirds. See, that third is flat, that third is right on the money. So if I wanted this chord to be equal tempered, I'd lower this note, I'd raise this note rather. If I wanted this to be more towards just, where the chords are in harmony, I'd raise this by about 10 cents. Okay? So you pick and choose. You pick and choose what you want. On the draw plate, tonic, you only have one tonic, and then third, and then fifths, 2/5, and then you have another octave here. So you have a lot of opportunities, except for the 2 draw. You have a lot of opportunities to pair off and do the tuning, right, as octaves. And then as individual notes, do I want the 3 to be compromised? Do I want it to be equal? Do I want it to be in perfect harmony? That's for you to decide, and then tune its pair. So I hope that answers your question. There's no to change the tuning, to change the temperament. It's really to pick your preference between chord harmony or individual notes, and then tune your notes in the regular fashion with those preferences in mind. So Peter Bog asks, does flat sanding the top reed plate make any difference in those harps where the plates are recessed, such as Special 20, rather than as part of a sandwich? Well, that's a fantastic question. Don't know what you mean 100%, but let me just recap. Where's my comb? Let's take the comb. Perfectly flat comb, let's say. Draw reed plate. I know it's the draw reed plate because all the tips of the reeds line up. Okay, see the base, the rivets, they don't line up. All the bases of these reeds line up. They are the blow plate. Okay, so draw plate, we can flat sand this, and we can even measure. If you're extreme like I am, you measure the flatness, and you can say, okay, it's really close. It's not. There's not one big bow. And you flat sand it on some so you flat sand on some 220 grit sandpaper. If there was too big of a bow, then you'd correct the bow, because flat sanding, if it was an extreme bow, you'd just end up flat sanding a streak in the middle or side to side, and you'd have to take off too much brass to actually sand it. The reed plate would be 0.3 millimeters thick when you're done. So you unbend it. And then you flat sand. So this surface and this surface is perfectly flat. This surface is perfectly flat. They sit well together. Now this surface is the surface that is in contact with the comb. How do I get it to be perfectly flat when the reeds are in the way? I can't flat sand it. I'd have to take off all the reeds, flat sand it, and then put the reeds back on. Guess what? Putting the reeds back on is going to mess up the flatness of your plate. Okay, it's really hard to do. I was sitting at a table with a pro player who'd been changing his own reeds for decades, and I said, give me that plate that you just worked on. And I looked at the flatness, and sure enough, it was shaped like a hockey stick. The tip of the reed plate was curved up after changing the reeds 4 or 5 times. Up and down the reed plate. His reed plates were bent, right? So it's very hard to do. It's far better to just measure the flatness and straighten it with the claws. And in fact, on a Special 20 harmonica, that's the best way to do. You don't want a custom comb on a recessed harmonica like a Special 20 or a Session or Suzuki Harpmaster. Those combs are meant to flex and act a little bit like a gasket, not too much because they're sort of a solid material. They don't kill the tone that much, but those combs don't have a lot of material, not like a solid surface comb like in the sandwich type harmonicas where this has to be flat. So the secret to getting a recessed type harmonica to be as powerful and to have everything as airtight and as aligned is to straighten the reed plates as best you can, and keep the stock. I don't have a Special 20 comb in front of me right now, but keep that stock ABS comb. That's what you want for this kind of harmonica. And by the way, I don't just jump in and flat sand the draw reed plate. I straighten it out before I flat sand. Now, what if the material itself that the reed plate is made of is not perfect, and I have to choose between making this side flat and making this side flat? What am I going to choose? I need the rivet side. I need the slots to be perfectly flat, or else the reeds won't cooperate as they get passed through the slot. So the draw reed plate is actually more of a challenge than the blow reed plate in that respect, because I have to worry about both sides of the draw reed plate. On the blow reed plate, I couldn't care less if after I'm done this side isn't perfectly flat, or it might be a bit rounded, so long as this side is straight. If this side is straight, I get an airtight seal, and I get that horizon, I get that perfectly flush slot on both sides, parallel, perfectly parallel, and that's all I want. So I hope that answers your question, Peter. Larry Yeomans, can you describe how to set up and assemble double reed plates? How do you align all interior slot walls? Same thing as I was saying. You need a donor plate. Remove all the reeds. Make it flat. Make it perfectly flat by straightening and then flat sanding. And you got to make that sandwiched. Sorry, working on the draw reed plate. You got to make that sandwiched reed plate that will sit between the comb and the reed plate. You got to make that perfectly flat, and you have to make the outer reed plate perfectly flat. Once you do that, you should be able to align them. You can put a dab of Vaseline to help them stick together, and then screw everything together. On the blow reed plate, you're going to take the reeds off another set of reed plates, and you're going to put that on top. So you're sort of extending the height of these chambers, the height above the reeds. And again, you have to make this surface perfectly flat, as well as this surface, and then that surface on your extra doubled reed plate that's going to fit on top of that. So it's flatness. Once you get the flatness, it's easy to line it up. And yeah, use a bit of Vaseline to help it stick together. Optimal gapping versus reed shaping. That's Fred Stover earlier, about how to take a quick look at the shape of your reeds and do some quick and dirty reed shape adjustment. So let's go a little bit more in depth as to what does it mean when I'm talking about a gap. So here's a picture of just a regular old reed, and you see the arrows at the tip. Those indicate your gap, and those will give you some idea of the amount of air that's escaping when the reed is at rest. Now obviously the reed isn't at rest as long because the air entrains it and pulls it down through the slot. Here is a reed with the exact same gap at the tip, but look at the shape of the reed. You can see that, wait a minute, at rest there's a lot less of an air space. The white, the amount of white that you see, the amount of brightness you see, is less. Now, equivalent gap, less white space, you're going to have a completely different responding reed. Although the gaps are the same, you're going to have a completely different experience. This might lock up on you. It might play louder at low breath, but it'll be a little bit frustrating to play, and it'll never be perfect, right? Here's a third example that sort of exaggerates what I'm talking about. On all three of these examples, you look at the arrows at the tip, the gap is exactly the same. But look at the amount of air that's passing through at rest. And then imagine this reed going through the slot. The belly of the reed here is going to pass through, and the rest won't, and you're going to have a miserable experience. So this will be sluggish to respond, and it won't respond very loudly. It'll sort of respond, but it'll choke up early. So these are three different tales, three completely different feeling and sounding reeds, but they all have the same gap. The moral of the story is that the gap is only part. It's only part of the picture, and you the optimal way to adjust your gaps is to not look at the measurement of the gap. There was some discussion about using feeler gauges. Well, in the situation of the 3 images that I just showed you, that feeler gauge is not going to give you the right story. Now, a feeler gauge is a way to gather information, right? So it's a method of measurement, okay? I suggest take your reed plates off if you want to invest some time in this harp and get it to playing optimal. Take the reeds off, take a look at them, take a look at the sides, take a look at the view from the sides. There's a video I have on Get a Grip, and it shows you more in detail how to do this. But try to look for the reeds that have a bad shape and then correct that shape. And here, this is the 7. We worked on this. We worked on the shape of this reed, and I'm happy with the shape. Sorry, here's the 7. I'm happy with the shape of this reed as it passes through the slot. And while you're making those adjustments, you consider how much room there is at the tip, okay? And then let's say I wanted this to sit a little bit higher at the tip. I can look at the rest of the reed and say, well, do I really want just the tip of the reed to go up, or do I want the whole thing from this part on, right? And let me look at with my own eyes. So let's say I want to raise the tip, I want to raise the gap of this reed, but I want to start from here. Well, then you move your tool to the back of the harp and you just do a little bit of pressure, and you've gapped that reed. And not only that, but you've preserved that shape that you want, right? Out of the box, right? Take a look at what this is telling you. Okay, so what I'm seeing is the tip of the reed is disappearing before the middle of the reed. So I want a gap. I want where I'm pushing to go down and this to go up. So I'll position my tool where I want it to be, and then I'll just I've corrected the shape of that reed. Which reed was it? It was this one. So that's a good shape. But now, I think the gap is a little bit too high. Well, I don't want to push from the tip because that'll mess up my shape. I want the whole thing. I want the whole apparatus to go down a touch. So I've gapped from the back of the reed. And ta-da! I got a great shaped reed. So that's optimal gapping. Well, that's the optimal way to change your gap. What's the optimal measurement of the gap? Well, then take your reed plate, put your comb together, and if you have a you need to have an airtight, straighten your plate so you have an airtight seal. So I got a great dynamic range there. I can hit it hard, I can hit it soft, and it responds. So probably because the reed shape is so good, I have a lot to work with, right? If the reed shape was very poor, then you're using the gap to make the best out of what you have to work with. If you make the reed shape good, you have more to work with and you have more range. But the way my point, basically what I'm saying, that the way you decide on the optimal gap is playing the channel. Use your breath. That's going to be the ultimate, because you might have differences in reed shape, subtle differences in reed shape, the way the brass was made, the way it was milled. They all have their own personalities and they react differently. So that the whatever value you give to the number of millimeters or tenth of a millimeters that it lays at rest doesn't tell you the whole story. Putting the harp to your mouth tells you the whole story. Okay, so use that to guide you to optimize gapping and optimize the reed shape to optimize your gapping experience.